Good evening, everybody. Welcome again to the College of St. Scholastica and for another lecture in the Alworth Peace and Justice lecture series. Delighted you're here. I can almost guarantee you a very stimulating evening. At least it's been stimulating for me all day. My name is Tom Morgan, and I am the director of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice, and this is the fourth in a series of 5 programs exploring the question of violence in the human story, in the human condition. And this lecture tonight is sponsored by the Alworth Center, as I said before, the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at the College of St. Scholastica, through the generous support of the Alworth family, and it's also funded in part by the Warner Lecture Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Ivre Foundation, and by Mary C. Van Ivre in memory of William Van Ivre, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, Reader Weekly of Duluth, and from numerous other private donors. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Wouldn't happen without you, I can guarantee that. On the screen to your left, we are displaying the text of tonight's lecture through technology called real-time captioning. Although we anticipate a high-quality format, this is the second time we've done this, there will inevitably be errors that are inherent to the technology. Nevertheless, research indicates that many viewers benefit from captioning, including those with hearing loss. A special thanks to the Edward H. Eddy Foundation, whose generous support makes this inclusive service possible. If you can't see that screen over there, there's some more seats, and you're welcome to take those so you get closer to that screen if you want to look at it. After the lecture next week, as usual, we'll have a talk back where we get together here on campus and chat about what we've heard and what we think about it and maybe what we should do next. This time the talk back will be facilitated by Ted Lewis. All his credentials are on this sheet of paper that you should have all received. He's Director of Communications at the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. So look for that. Oh, on Wednesday, well, it's all right here in Tower Hall, room 2607 at 7 o'clock. Coming attractions here at the college include a lecture sponsored by the College of St. Scholastica Theology and Religious Studies Department and Women and Gender Studies Department, entitled Rape, Culture, Spiritual Violence, and Visions of Healing. That's on the 31st of March, which is also a Thursday. And then this series on violence will conclude in April 7th, with Rosalie Regal, who will talk about crossing lines and doing time, people who are doing serious civil disobedience. After the lecture, as usual, you are welcome to ask questions, and please come to these microphones, and the speaker will just recognize you in turn. But those of you from the community, I'm delighted you're here, but please defer to the students. Let them ask questions first. That's what we built this hall for, was for the students, so we'd like to let them go first. And then if there's time, and I think there will be, you community people are very welcome to ask questions. One other thing, you should have gotten an evaluation as you came in. From time to time, we like to do that, see how we're doing, so you might fill that out and turn it in at the table out there. And if you're not on our mailing list and you want to be, you can do that by filling out the forms on a table out in the foyer. So, on to the main event. Our speaker this evening is an internationally recognized authority on political violence and its alternatives. She is professor and Associate Dean for Research at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and she has been for many years an associate senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, Norway. She currently is co-chair of the Academic Council at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. She's a fellow at the One Earth Future Foundation, and she's a counselor at the Peace Science Society International and a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. Foreign Policy magazine ranked her among the top 100 global thinkers of 2013. She also won the 2014 Karl Deutsch Award given by the International Studies Association to the scholar under 40 who has made the most significant impact on the field of international politics or peace research. Erica Chenoweth is the author, with Maria J. Steffen, of Why Civil Resistance Works, which has earned several prestigious awards. That book, by the way, is on sale in our foyer after the lecture. Before coming to the University of Denver, Professor Chenoweth taught at Wesleyan University, where she won the 2010 Carol A. Baker Memorial Prize for Excellence in Junior Faculty Research and Teaching. She's also held visiting appointments at Harvard, Stanford, UC Berkeley, and the University of Maryland. Professor Chenoweth has edited Political Violence and co-edited Rethinking Violence with Adria Lawrence. Her next book, forthcoming, is Democracy Encourages Terrorism, in which she explores underlying reasons why terrorism is so common in democratic countries. Excuse me. Professor Chenoweth has presented her research all over the world at various academic conferences, government workshops, and international government organizations, including an appearance at the 2013 World Summit of Nobel Peace Prize laureates in Warsaw. And now she's made it to the College of St. Scholastica. This will be something to put in your resume. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, The Economist, the Boston Globe, Foreign Policy, the Christian Science Monitor, NPR's Morning Edition, and many other places. She co-hosts the award-winning blog Political Violence at a Glance and hosts the blog Rational Insurgent. In 2008, Professor Chenoweth established the Program on Terrorism and Insurgency Research, a think tank that produces policy-relevant research on the causes and effects of insurgency, terrorism, and strategic nonviolent resistance. The program now at the Corbel School in Denver supports multiple projects and provides students with opportunities to engage in research related to the program's mission. In her spare time, she enjoys trekking and fly fishing in the Rocky Mountains, traveling to adventurous destinations, and listening to all kinds of music from hip-hop to opera to everything in between. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Erica Chenoweth.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Tom, for that amazing introduction, which lower your expectations maybe a little bit. That was, you read off a lot of things from my CV, and it made me sound good. We'll see how it goes. I also want to thank the college for such a hospitable welcome. It was wonderful sharing a meal with many of you and talking politics. And so I hope that we can go forward tonight in spirit of trying to better understand why civil resistance works, when it doesn't. And I absolutely welcome comments, critiques, questions, insults. Anything along those lines is fine after the formal remarks are finished, and I've handled them all before, so we'll go from there. So before I get started, I wanted to let you know where I was when I first came to this research. I was finishing my PhD at the University of Colorado, and I was what you might call a traditional guns and bombs kind of political scientist. I studied things that blow up, the people that make them blow up, and try to understand why that happens. And so I'd spent a lot of my time in graduate school trying to collect data on terror violence, terror groups, and where they appear in the world most often. And I'd come across this interesting correlation between democracy and the emergence of new terror organizations. So that was what my thesis was about. And I got this interesting email from a colleague of mine who also studied terrorism. And he said, "This is the other side of the coin, ha, ha, ha." And I looked at the body of the email, and it was a forwarded invitation to a workshop called People, Power, and Pedagogy that was taking place down the road. And the organizers of the workshop was an educational foundation called the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And their mission is to spread knowledge and information about the theory and practice of nonviolent resistance. And I was curious about this particular workshop because it was so close and it offered free books and food. And you know, being a good graduate student, I couldn't turn down an opportunity to get those things, so I applied and got in. And they sent me the big box of books in advance and asked me to read them. And they were books by people like Gene Sharp, Peter Ackerman, Jack Duvall, Stephen Zunis, Kurt Schock, and a few other people that were making a set of claims that I found pretty disturbing to my knowledge base. And what they were basically all saying was that nonviolent resistance, where unarmed civilians actively promote conflict and confront an opponent using a variety of techniques like protests, strikes, demonstrations, go slows, stay-aways, and hundreds of other techniques of nonviolent action, that they could actually be as effective or even more effective than violent insurgents in achieving their political outcomes. And you know, what struck me about this argument was that, first of all, they were calling on a number of different examples like Serbia or the Philippines, where it was clear that people power had made a difference. But for every example where it had worked, I could think of a half dozen examples off the top of my head where organized protests had been basically slaughtered by opponents that were willing to use brutal violence against them. And so when I went to the workshop, I kept bringing up my reservations, and I'll share them with you. And here I call them common claims because I hear them all the time from well-meaning people like myself at the time. So the first thing I thought was that nonviolent resistance of this kind can't succeed if the opponent, that is the tyrant that they're opposing, is very powerful, that they have massive military means to deploy against the civilians, that they're repressive, meaning they're absolutely willing to use it to actually kill their own people or to kill a group of people in a foreign occupied territory in order to maintain the status quo, or if they're authoritarian regimes, meaning that they've completely shut down any space for active political organizing and opposition. The second major reservation I had was more related to my familiarity with the topic, or lack thereof, going into this workshop, which is that I thought that nonviolent resistance was typically associated with reform goals like wage disputes, or trying to achieve fairer economic justice, or racial justice reforms. And I associated it with broad-based social movements for progressive changes in society. But I thought that if it came down to needing to remove a leadership from national power, or if it came to trying to secede territory or kick out a foreign military occupation, that basically that's when violent insurgency becomes the only tool that we associate with those goals. And then the third reservation I had really came from an important article that was published in summer of 2006 in the journal International Security by my colleague Max Abrams. The article is called "Why Terrorism Does Not Work." And in it, what Max does is he collects data on all of the different significant foreign terror organizations in the State Department's list. And he looks at how many of them actually achieved what they said they wanted, and found that only 7% had done so. And on the last page of his article, he says 7% is a very unimpressive success rate. So why do we see so much terrorism if it's such an abject failure? And he speculates that at even just 7% effectiveness, that it's probably more effective than nonviolent protest. So this was the intellectual environment that I was emerging from when I went to this workshop, as I've mentioned. So I'm bringing up all these arguments. People are getting really irritated. And at the end of the week, I sat down with this woman, Maria Steffen, who was one of ICNC's educational outreach coordinators. And I said, you know, like, I can help you guys, if you're interested, develop a research design that would actually get at this question, because I don't think you're totally selling the skeptics on this question about whether nonviolent resistance works. And if you wanted to find out, what you could do is you could develop a longitudinal study. Go back, you know, in history to, say, 1900, pick an arbitrary date, and then look worldwide at every country in the world and figure out where there were comparable kinds of people power movements versus violent insurgencies. And then look at whether they achieved their goals and be really strict about it. So look at whether they achieved their goals within a year of the peak of the campaign, and look at whether they got everything they said they wanted and that they had a discernible impact on that outcome. And if you do that, then you can actually count side by side the incidences of violent and nonviolent resistance, and you can assess their relative success rates. And she said, great, let's do it. And so she and I sat down and over the course of another 2 years, basically engaged in an intellectual bet about whether nonviolent resistance works. And I thought I was going to be on the winning side, showing that violence blows nonviolent resistance out of the water. So ultimately, after 2 years of collecting these data, what we did is structure the study from 1900 to 2006, which is when we started the work. I've since updated the data through the last quarter of 2015, and I'm going to show you the latest results, hot off the press. We also looked at a very specific kind of campaign. So we looked only at resistance movements that were trying to achieve those maximalist goals that I'm so skeptical about. So only the ones that are trying to remove a dictator from power, or that are trying to secede and become an independent country, or kick out a foreign military or colonial occupation. Those I associated as maximal goals because they'd fundamentally reshape the sovereign country that the people were living in. They all had to have had at least 1,000 observed participants, and that includes the violent and the nonviolent campaigns. And as I mentioned, they all had to have achieved success, that is, the removal of the leader or independence, within a year of the peak. And we had to have found clear evidence that the campaign itself made a difference in that outcome. So for example, if a dictator dies of a heart attack while in office, even though you might be able to make an indirect case that the movement might have had something to do with the stress and that could have led to the heart attack, we would not count that as a success. So things like forcing a dictator to hold competitive elections, or forcing an occupier to allow you to have significant autonomy over your territory do not count as success in our metrics. So after looking at all that, we had, at the time, 323 cases of violent and nonviolent resistance from 1900 to 2006. And nowadays, we have 429 cases. And what you can see is that the nonviolent resistance campaigns have outperformed the violent ones by about a 2-to-1 margin in terms of total success. They're also more likely to achieve those significant concessions short of full success. And one of the really striking things that we've uncovered and that I've further developed in this research since then is the dramatic rise in the incidence of nonviolent resistance, especially over the last 40 years. So here you can see the distribution of nonviolent resistance versus violent resistance. These are new campaigns that set on during a given decade, and look at the decline and the new incidences of violence. This is not something that you might infer from watching the nightly news, right? What we infer from watching the nightly news is that we live in a desperately violent time. But what we can see in these data is that actually we live in the time of the legacy of Gandhi and King, where we are witnessing the most contentious, nonviolent civil disobedience era recorded, at least since the 1900s. And so this really is a very interesting phenomenon that, at least through 2006, could be easily explained by the increasing success rates of nonviolent resistance over time. So when Maria and I actually sat down and wrote our book, it was the case that nonviolent resistance was actually becoming even more effective decade by decade. And it was up to about 70% effectiveness in that decade up to 2006. So why is this? Why is this happening? For a person like me, this is a very puzzling result. It did not make sense in light of any of the prior research that I had done myself. And what was even more stunning about this is that I didn't know any mainstream, quote-unquote, security studies or political science scholars who knew anything about this. So it was an entirely new kind of empirical discovery that many people had written about and written very compelling case studies about, but it hadn't been systematically demonstrated before. And so when we drilled down into the data and we tried to look at the specific attributes of these campaigns and their environments, we found a really important result, and that is that nonviolent resistance campaigns' power inheres from their ability to attract large and diverse and inclusive participation from the societies in which they emerge. So it is not a huge kind of rocket science to suggest that the larger a revolutionary movement is, the more likely it is to succeed. A political economist named Mark Lickbach speculated in his 1995 book, The Rebel's Dilemma, that there was what he called the 5% rule. The 5% rule was that any government anywhere that faced a 5% challenge, popular challenge from below, meaning 5% of its population was rising up against it, any government that faced that measure of challenge could not survive. That sounds like a pretty small proportion of the population, but if you think about the United States today, that would be like 15 million people or something, so not that small. Now, what's really interesting is that when we went into our data and looked at the actual participation rates at peak levels, what we found is that it's pretty close to 5%, but it's more like 3.5%. So any movement that actually attracted the active participation of 3.5% of the population won. And many of them won with less than that, but that seemed to be the magic number. And what was even more striking is that very few of the campaigns that we looked at achieved that 3.5% threshold unless they were nonviolent mass movements. So the nonviolent campaigns are the ones that were getting the largest number of people participating. In fact, if you just look at the number of participants as a function of the total population of a society, nonviolent campaigns are something like 11 times larger than the average violent campaign. So why would it be that nonviolent campaigns get more people to participate? Well, we think there are lower barriers to participating in nonviolent campaigns in general. The first is a lower physical barrier, which is to say that engaging in any kind of organized armed activity requires a certain level of physical commitment, agility, and sacrifice that many people, many ordinary people, simply aren't willing or able to perform. So I'll give you a really mundane example from my own history, which is that when I was in college, I thought that a good idea would be for me to go into ROTC so that I could get them to pay for my college and then go into the Army after I graduated and get my career started that way. And the reason I ended up leaving ROTC wasn't because I didn't like the militarism, it's because I hated the 4:30 a.m. wake-up time to do the workouts. And running 10 miles until you throw up at 4:30 in the morning is not my idea of fun. So I abandoned the organized armed activity and did something else. Now, this is a really silly, mundane example, but the truth is that anybody who's going to engage in sustained armed activity in an organized way is going to have to do stuff like that they don't like. And what that means is that you're just not going to get as many people who are physically willing to commit to these types of things. Nonviolent resistance has such a wide variety of tactics. One of them is a favorite for couch potatoes. It is the stay-at-home demonstration. The stay-at-home demonstration means do what you're doing right now for 3 days straight. And if everybody in here did this for 3 days straight, and a whole city did this for 3 days straight, that city's economy would shut down, right? It's a very powerful technique of nonviolent action, requires no physical ability at all whatsoever. just requires you to stay at home. And in fact, the stay-at-home demonstration is a very popular technique for movements under strain because of repression. So many times you'll see examples of movements that start to face very fierce violence from their opponents when they're outdoors doing protests, and all of a sudden, nobody's on the streets anymore. And it's because they're doing the stay-at-home demonstration, a very powerful and disruptive tactic with much lower risk. The second lower barrier to participation is a lower commitment barrier. And by this, I don't mean commitment to the cause. I just mean the barriers to entry and the barriers to exit from the movement are lower for nonviolent campaigns. So for organized armed action, I study a lot of these rebel groups and insurgent movements. And generally, the recruitment strategy requires at the outset a demonstration of loyalty to join the movement. Usually what that means is that the person is assigned to kill somebody on the other side, and they do that to ensure that the recruit that just showed up as a volunteer is not an informant. So once the recruit carries out the order to kill the person on the other side, the movement becomes their protection. They can't leave because they're going to be fugitives from the law for the rest of their lives, and so it solidifies the commitment to the movement. Oftentimes, they'll engage in other types of very explicit human rights abuses, precisely to solidify their commitment to the movement that can give them away if they want to, or keep them safe if they want to. Nonviolent campaigns, on the other hand, generally don't require people to give up their day job or go on the run to participate. There are often some people in the movements that do. They have to kind of go underground or whatever, but the widespread popular participation that makes these campaigns so effective doesn't really require people to quit school or quit their day job or leave their family behind. The third lower barrier to participation is a lower informational barrier. And here what I mean is that armed actions, because of the clandestine nature of their planning and their operations, it's very difficult to read from them how many people are actually in the movement. So terrorist groups, for example, will often use very spectacular demonstrations of violence to overrepresent how truly powerful they are. A very famous example of this is the November 17 movement in Greece, which for about 30 years conducted sustained bombings and the occasional shooting in Athens. As it turned out, it was only 3 people. But nobody knew that until they were thwarted in their last attack just about 8 years ago. For nonviolent campaigns, if you are thinking about joining, all you have to do is ask a friend that you know is involved, how many people do you think there are going to be? Or if you're predisposed to anxiety like I am, let's say that you are living in your apartment, you live in a very repressive country, and your neighbor comes to you and says, we're going to have a demonstration tonight down at the main public square, just down the road from your apartment, and it's going to start at 8 o'clock, and we expect the police to come and kind of beat us up a little bit, so make sure you have an escape route planned, and I hope to see you there. I know that you sort of like what we're doing in this movement. Now, if you're like me, you're not going to be the person who shows up at 7:45 and waits for everybody else to arrive. If you're like me, what you'll do is you'll peek out your window at, say, 8:30 or so and see how many people are down there, and then maybe how many more people look like they're coming down there. And, if I see like 6 people down in the square and it's the usual suspects, I'm going to sit this one out. But if I see 6,000 people and I see more coming down the way, I could just join myself and stand in the middle and have a party, which is what that starts to look like when you have 6,000 people in one place. Then finally, there's a lower cognitive barrier to participation in a campaign that doesn't require any of its adherents to engage in offensive violence. Cognitive psychologists have long studied this interesting puzzle that human beings have this remarkable set of inhibitors in our brains to violence, most human beings. And so what that means is that when we engage in offensive violence, the average person generally has to undergo considerable training and sort of programming in order to get them to do it without hesitation. Now, this is well documented by many different army psychologists and psychiatrists who have long studied the phenomenon of battlefield ineffectiveness due to deliberate malfunction of weapons or defection and desertion. And many militaries have invested billions of dollars into understanding why it is that their troops won't offensively engage. And they basically found out that they have to be trained to do that. So for nonviolent resistance, nobody is asking anybody to sort of override the inhibitors that they have in their brain, and that just makes it easier for people to participate. So why does participation matter? Is it just because all these people fled the streets and it disrupts everything? What Maria and I suggest is that that's not really what's going on as much. What goes on is that the larger and more diverse the population is, the more likely it is that people are going to have connections with the opponent's pillars of support. So let me make this a really concrete thing. The pillars of support for the opponent are the institutions and the relationships that a regime relies on to maintain the status quo. So the police, the security forces, state media, economic and business elites, civilian bureaucrats, religious and cultural authorities, and the like. And the idea here is that no regime, no matter how tyrannical and brutal, is permanent in its power base, that it is always 100% dependent on the cooperation, obedience, and help of people that reside in those pillars. So even if you're a totalitarian regime, there are all kinds of institutions and people that have to do what you say in order for you to stay in power. Now, Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, was very inspiring to Gene Sharp, who is sort of the grandfather of strategic nonviolent action on this subject. And her work really spoke to this idea that power is not based on the ability to deploy violence. Actually, power is based on the ability to voluntarily get consent to obedience from the people that reside below you. And the idea here is that when people withdraw their cooperation, even the most tyrannical power holder can't stay there. So Gene Sharp took this a little bit further and argued that in general, there are identifiable pillars that every tyrant or unjust colonial occupier has to have in support of them and cooperating with them in order to keep things calm. And in fact, the main strategy of civil resistance is not to melt those people's hearts and convert them. It's to put pressure on them so that in their own interest, it becomes a bad idea to continue to obey. So let me give you an example of this. In 2000, there was a big popular uprising in Serbia to remove Slobodan Milosevic from power. It was a big opposition uprising that was largely helped by a student movement, but involved a lot of different political parties and opposition groups. And this movement started to attract people from all over the country. The countryside, it brought peasants from villages way out in the mountains, and it brought people from Belgrade. Now, as this movement grew in its diversity, it started to be able to grow in its capacity to affect those people that lived in those pillars of support, particularly the security forces. So when hundreds of thousands of people came to Belgrade and demanded that Slobodan Milosevic leave power in October of 2000, the security forces were standing in a line protecting the parliament building, and they were ordered to shoot live fire on those demonstrators. They refused the order. We know that the order came because the activists had stolen a couple of radios and heard it. And they looked and saw those police, and they were all just standing there, kind of looking at each other out of the corner of their eyes, and none of them moved and didn't fire into the crowd. Within a couple days, Slobodan Milosevic fled the country, and that was the end. So those police were noticed by a lot of academics and journalists who went and asked them, what were you thinking? Like, why didn't you fire on the demonstrators? And they explained that, I thought my kids might be in the crowd. Or, even more mundane, I thought the guy who sold me liquor on Saturdays might have been in the crowd, and he sells it at a discount, and I thought that if we shot into the crowd, I might not get my discounted liquor on Saturdays, right? So notice how this isn't a moral thing. It's not about melting their hearts. It's about making a very clear demonstration that their lives will change in ways they cannot totally control if they follow the order, and their lives might change for the better if they don't. And in fact, this is why the nonviolent resistance is so effective in provoking those shifts in loyalty among those pillars of support. Because the movement, on the one hand, is saying, this has to stop, and on the other hand is saying, we don't want to hurt you. In fact, we want you to be part of the new society. So Maria and I tested this hypothesis, and it turns out that Sharp was largely right, that as nonviolent campaigns grow in size, the probability that security forces defect or outright disobey orders to repress increases quite a lot. And this effect doesn't occur to the same degree when the campaigns are violent, because when it's violent insurgents shooting at them, they tend to coalesce and unify, and their training kicks in and they shoot back. So it is the case that sometimes nonviolent campaigns do get repressed by the opponent. And even when that's true, we find that the nonviolent campaigns have about a 2-to-1 advantage over violent ones in terms of their long-term effectiveness. Why is that the case? Well, we think there are two things really going on here. The first is the process of backfire, which is when the intended effect of the repression is not what happens. In fact, the opposite happens. So if a regime is trying to make people go home and it uses repression to try to scare them into doing that, backfire would mean that the next day twice as many people show up because they're so angry about the repression from the day before. A scholar named Brian Martin identified that the process of backfire really relies on a couple of key attributes of the incident, one of which is the fact that the incident produces moral outrage because it's perceived as unjust, disproportional, or excessive compared to the threat. And what we observe is that there's a generalized pattern that when repression takes place against nonviolent actors, that people are more likely to be morally outraged than when it happens against violent actors. The second thing that I think is going on, and might even be more important in a lot of conflicts, is the fact that as campaigns get very large, it becomes really costly to continue to repress them. So costly that the regime can't actually sustain it. And this was Mark Lichtbach's kind of 5% rule that I told you about earlier. Now, there are two groups of methods of nonviolent action that I think are really apropos here. Methods of concentration, which is when large numbers of people gather in a specific space to disrupt it. So this would be like a demonstration or a protest. And then there are methods of dispersion. This is when people stay away from places they're expected to go. That's your sit-in-your-seat strike. So when a movement is very large, it can shift between these methods and maintain disruption in ways that make repression really hard. Like, it is really, really costly to repress a stay-at-home demonstration. It can be done, but it is costly. You have to pay people overtime. You have to make sure that they're safe when they go into the person's home and arrest them. There's all kinds of risks that come to pass. And security forces, a lot of times in these societies, start calling in sick for that kind of work. I'll give you an example from history, the Iranian Revolution, the one from 1977 to 79. So in this uprising, the peak of it was often referred to as the 100 Days Revolution. And the first 90 or so days of this involved mass demonstrations that were brutally repressed by the Shah's regime, which was US-backed. The protesters started to realize that day after day, they were basically getting cut down in the streets. Their tactics were becoming quite predictable, and they put many people who were participating in the direct line of fire with regime snipers and then ultimately military forces. So the last 10 or so days, the movement got a very welcome participation of an important ally, which was oil workers who worked in the fields and the rural areas. And these oil workers went on strike and paired it with a stay-at-home demonstration. So when the internal security forces came door to door, they pulled the oil workers back out onto the street, they got to the oil fields, and the workers worked at half pace. The security forces started to get nervous. This happened day after day. They would go door to door, pull the people out onto the street, march them to the oil fields, and they work at half pace. After 4 or 5 days of this, the security forces started calling in sick to work. Why is that? Because they thought, I was promised overtime, but these oil fields are not pumping, and we're not going to get it. And I'm not going to do this kind of really uncomfortable repression that's very personal and face-to-face, knowing that I have to live down the street with these people for the rest of my life, and that our kids go to school together, and it could change all of our lives if we continue this repression. So they abandoned the Shah, and he had to leave the country, of course, as we know. So these are good examples of how large movements are able to wield and maneuver around repression in ways that allow them to maintain disruption while also staying relatively safe. So I'm going to wrap it up pretty soon, but I want to talk a little bit about those cases of violent insurgency that succeed. Because we know they do sometimes, about 25% of the time, violent campaigns actually win. And so Maria and I wanted to do some evaluation of understanding what are the long-term impacts of a victorious violent insurgency compared with the long-term impacts of nonviolent resistance. So we looked at 2 outcomes in our book, and I've since been looking at another one. The first is the impacts of nonviolent versus violent resistance on democracy. Now, we used a fairly strict measure of whether the country is a democracy 5 years after the campaign is over. We don't think democracy is everything, but I'll borrow from Winston Churchill and say that even though it's a horrible form of government, it's better than the other ones that have been tried from time to time. What we see here is that this is the probability that a country is a democracy by most political scientists' standards within 5 years after the campaign is over. And this axis shows us what the country was a year before the campaign ended. So we're controlling here for the nature of the regime prior to the campaign's end. And what we can see here is that -5 to 10 are what most political scientists would consider authoritarian regimes. Between a -5 and a 5 is mixed regimes, or what we call anocracies. They have some mixtures of democracy like elections, but then they don't have any civil liberties or kind of free participation in those elections, so that would be like an anocracy. And then we have the +5 or higher, which is what most political scientists consider democratic institutions. So what we can see here is that when violent campaigns win against any kind of regime from a totalitarian system up to a high-end anocracy, only about like 30% of the time do they result in a democratic transition. And then you can see this is a really kind of troubling finding that even among the democracies that face violent insurgencies, only about half of them remain democracies 5 years after the campaign is over. So this is the familiar kind of creeping of counterinsurgency logic into things like civil liberties, checks and balances, separation of powers, and so forth. So violent insurgency is very dangerous for democracies in maintaining their democracy. Then we can see the difference with nonviolent campaigns, where you can already see that among the authoritarian regimes, we're already seeing like a 10-fold increase in the probability that the country will be a democracy after the campaign is over. And then we see this huge spike, and we can see that basically any democracy that fights a nonviolent campaign is still one after the campaign is over. And one of the things that really struck me about these findings, and that is really important, I think, is that even in the cases where nonviolent campaigns failed, that is, they didn't win by overthrowing the dictator or whatever, and even those cases, those countries are still 4 times more likely to be democratic 5 years after they fail than any of the violent insurgencies, including the ones that succeed. So even when nonviolent resistance fails in the short term, it still often empowers reformers and starts ushering in and putting pressure on different types of reforms that ultimately do result in relatively more political freedom. The second outcome that we were really interested in is resurgence of civil war. And it turns out that nonviolent campaigns are about 15% less likely to have a resurgence or a relapse into civil war within 10 years compared with violent campaigns. And then another finding that I'm really interested in now is the impact of the method of struggle on mass atrocities. That is, major episodes of regime violence against campaigns or of dissidents that result in at least 1,000 fatalities in a single shot. So this would be like your Rabaa massacre or Tiananmen Square or the Dili massacre in East Timor. And it turns out that one of the best predictors of whether a government engages in a mass killing toward its own population is whether the campaign is violent. In fact, violent campaigns are the most common predictor of a mass killing, which is what most people would consider one of those agenda items for President Obama to try to prevent is mass atrocities. So a lot of people have asked us about, okay, so you're talking about democratic reform, you're talking about stable societies, low humanitarian catastrophe rates, and so forth, but what else does nonviolent resistance correlate to? Are there other types of targets besides dictators and foreign military occupations that nonviolent resistance has helped with? And certainly there's a lot of new research coming out that looks at these different types of campaigns. I've done some work on corporate human rights abuses in developing countries. It turns out that consumers, shareholders, and middle managers are just like states' pillars of support. They're very sensitive to things like reputation, and they're very sensitive to cost in the bottom line. And so, when movements are able to disrupt and put pressure on those different pillars, indeed, we have found that the same kind of dynamic takes place. In fact, 48% of the campaigns that we've looked at in 4 different developing countries succeeded, which is remarkably close to the proportion that have succeeded against states. The second group that is really interesting is armed rebel groups. So many people ask about ISIS or different types of rebel actors and whether civil resistance is effective against them. My colleague Oliver Kaplan has a great book coming out called Civilian Autonomy and Civil War, where he studied the phenomenon of peace villages in Colombia and their ability to actually engage in nonviolent civil disobedience against all different armed actors in the Colombian Civil War to protect civilians from the violence that they did not want to participate in. There's also a great deal of work about the impacts of nonviolent resistance on racial justice reforms. And one of the most important papers is one that's just come out. It's a working paper by Omar Wassow, who's a professor at Princeton, who studies the relative impacts of violent and nonviolent protest efforts during the civil rights movement and the impacts that those different techniques had on public opinion about what the most important problem facing the United States was. And what he shows is that when the protests stayed relatively nonviolent, people responded to these public opinion polls by saying the most important issue is civil rights. And then as soon as the violent protests started to take over, people started arguing the most important issue is law and order. And so what we can see is that impact that it has on pulling in those potential third parties that can really put pressure on the pillars of support and create change. And then many other people have been interested in questions regarding labor rights, economic justice, and climate change reform. And I'll point you to one paper by a guy named Hewitt Vaughn, who's a professor at Middlebury. He's an economist. And he has looked at the effects of nonviolent resistance and participation rates on labor reforms in France and other places, and basically has replicated these results in that context. I'm only telling you all of this just to say that one of the key concerns of a macro study like this is its replicability across other types of contexts and cases. And so far, the evidence that I've seen from these newer works by others suggests that we can have greater confidence in the underlying principles that I've talked about here tonight. So I'm going to leave you with a couple key takeaways. The first is about just kind of wrapping up what the big three takeaways are from the results that I've suggested so far. So the first is that nonviolent resistance as a method of active conflict is a surprisingly successful force in creating major political and social change, even dramatic, radical political and social change. And while I would never argue, and no intellectually honest person could argue, that it could always succeed anywhere, it definitely succeeds way more often than most of its detractors want you to believe. So that's the first point. The second point is that, and this is stuff I haven't showed you tonight, but when we control for all kinds of different factors, demographic characteristics of a country, the level of authoritarianism, military might, population statistics, culture and region of the world, economic development and things like that, even when we control for all those factors, these findings are very robust, meaning that it's happening in all kinds of different countries. There are no cultures that are immune from the practice of civil resistance or the power of civil resistance. And in fact, this technique has worked in lots of places where you would expect civil resistance to be impossible, like Chile under Pinochet or Denmark under the Nazis. And then the third big takeaway is the vital importance in connecting means to ends. This was a very crucial insight that Gandhi tried to perpetuate, but he felt was lost on many followers. That the way that one fights the battle is going to determine the way the country looks when the battle is over. And in fact, what he argued is that one cannot separate the means from the ends, the way that one struggles with nonviolent action and the outcome of a nonviolent society. And if it's really true that that's what people are trying to create, a peaceful and just society, then it's really important to consider that these means are strongly correlated with those outcomes. So I would say that there are a couple key things for students of civil resistance to take away. The first is that basically power doesn't appear to flow from the barrel of a gun as much as people often suspect. It actually seems to flow from the ability of a power holder to maintain the consent of and the obedience of the people that she or he rules. And in fact, that consent is not permanent. It has to be earned. It's really about legitimacy rather than force. The second thing that this really points to is the role of civilians in conflict. In particular, in my field of international relations, civilians are usually seen as either victims of abuse or resources to loot or plunder, but they don't generally get seen as active agents who can, by their own decisions and conscience, shape the outcomes of the conflicts in which they are involved. And I think this research asks us to elevate the status of the civilian a little bit more in this scholarship in general to agents in conflict rather than only victims or resources of conflict. And it also really kind of points us to a larger philosophical or epistemological debate in academia, which is, you know, can people actually decide their futures, or are they just subject to the whims of the structures around them and their environments? And this is a long-standing debate, and I'm not going to resolve it here, but I would suggest that because we have not been able to isolate any conditions where civil resistance is impossible or hasn't succeeded, this really calls into question this idea that people don't decide, that their environments decide their actions for them, and instead suggests that people actually are making choices that can alter their futures. For policymakers, I'll point out just a couple of things. It is often discussed when an armed insurgency arrives somewhere on the international scene whether our government, the United States government, ought to support the rebels or their opponents. Now, one thing that I can tell you from this research is that if it is true that the government supports the rebels, then the outcome is going to probably be, like with almost total certainty, an authoritarian regime, if they win, with a massive humanitarian catastrophe in the meantime because of the atrocities that take place against civilians in the context of counterinsurgency campaigns. And the country is likely to remain in turmoil through a conflict trap that will resurrect itself every 10 or 15 years over and over again. So that's what we see in our data, which suggests that if spreading democracy, human rights, and minimizing humanitarian strife are really sincere goals of the US government, we should probably not be giving rebels guns. That's what this finding suggests very strongly. So then the question is, well, whom do we support? We, meaning the US government right now. And I would say that our findings suggest that actually by giving direct material aid to nonviolent campaigns, they actually aren't that much more likely to succeed. And actually, if you think about it, it makes sense. Part of it is because nonviolent campaigns win because of domestic popular legitimacy and participation. So if you're participating in a nonviolent campaign and you find out that your leadership is on the bankroll of a foreign government, you might not be real thrilled about that, and you might stop showing up. It could also give the regime a lot of excuse to call you traitors or to use propaganda to minimize your popular appeal. So many of these campaigns do better without direct support from a foreign government. That said, there is a wide skill set and base of knowledge that is required for nonviolent campaigns to succeed. And so how do people get skills and knowledge? They get it from other people, not necessarily governments, but other people who've been there before. And so I want to suggest, and then over the next 2 years empirically test, the argument that actually civilian-to-civilian initiatives are what might be the most potent mechanism for change and for empowering people in using nonviolent resistance in their environments. We have some anecdotal evidence to suggest that even moderate amounts of training and preparation about basic common knowledge, like how long does it take for a nonviolent campaign to succeed, completely change the way that people build a strategy and effectively organize to promote change in their societies. And so what I want to suggest is that nights like tonight, where ordinary people are getting together and talking about this difficult question and trying to wrap our minds around how we can realize change in our societies, are basically the future of support for nonviolent movements. And so I'm going to leave you with a couple of key facts, and then I'm going to stop talking. The first key fact is that the average nonviolent campaign takes about 3 years to run its course. So, for those planning nonviolent campaigns, it's not a matter of how to get through the next 3 weeks of tactics. It's about how to plan a 3-year strategy. And if we think about this in kind of military terms, which is uncomfortable to some, but I think makes some sense, tactics don't lead strategy. Strategy leads tactics. So we build our strategy, and then we populate our strategy with tactics that will get us toward the ultimate goal. And I think even if we think about campaigns as something that we can purposively organize and plan, rather than something we improvise when bad things happen, we'll start to see a wholly different society that we live in. So with that, I'm going to leave you with some contact information, and again, invite your challenges, your questions, your comments, your feedback, and even your insults. I can take it. Thanks.
I was wondering what you think the impact of social media will be on the organization of nonviolent resistance groups.
That's a great question. So I'm a skeptic when it comes to social media. Part of the reason is because the huge explosion in nonviolent campaigns preceded the onset of the internet. So we've seen this phenomenon spreading before we had contemporary internet technology and social media. The second thing is that social media is open, and usually governments have far more resources to devote to figuring out how to use it to capture and surveil people than activists have at their disposal to figure out how to use it effectively to coordinate. A couple of really disturbing examples, I'll give you one. In Sudan in January of 2011, Omar Bashir became nervous that he might face an Arab uprising of his own, and so had some of his security forces build a very compelling-looking Facebook site calling for a protest. It had really excellent graphic art. It looked like something that the most creative millennial would have created. It called for people to RSVP, and 17,000 people RSVP'd. When the first organizers showed up to sort of figure out what was going on at the protest, the security forces rounded them up and tortured them, and were able to get their Facebook passwords, and that's all they needed to round up the rest. So I think it's actually very dangerous to over-rely on social media as a method of communication and coordination, just as a tactical matter. And then I also worry sometimes about the ability of social media to transmit the wrong kinds of lessons to people about nonviolent resistance. So for example, I think that right now, people see things like mass demonstrations and sit-ins as sort of the modal kind of effective nonviolent resistance, but it isn't. Strikes are the most effective form of nonviolent resistance and organized labor action. But because we see these very spectacular pictures that get flashed around on social media, people think, oh, we can just import that tactic into our context and it'll work. And so it doesn't, and it fails utterly. And then people think, well, nonviolent resistance doesn't work. And so I think it's actually very tricky, and I think that it just calls for us to be a bit smarter about how we deploy social media and to certainly have a few backup plans when it goes awry.
All right, thank you.
Hi there, thanks for coming tonight. My question for you is, do you think that the world wars could have been avoided using nonviolent movements? And if so, how would the outcomes be different?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The First World War actually came into being in the context of the world's first peace movement. The peace movement itself then got a boost from World War I, but really emerged in the late 19th century and was very new at the time. In fact, most of the peace movement really generated itself as a result of World War I and then moved into World War II. With conscientious objectors and people along those lines. It did not have the popular support that it does today. And in fact, I think that many people think of the peace movement in general as being fairly unsuccessful because of its inability to stop or forestall major wars when politicians seem to want to do them in the first place. I can tell you, though, that the First World War was at least aided along by violent uprisings of various kinds, both in terms of national self-determination movements, but also a global anarchist network that took it upon itself to assassinate heads of state every year for about 35 years as part of a way to overthrow the sort of monarchical and dynastic order of sovereignty at the time. And it was extremely disruptive and resulted in massive crackdowns by governments against their populations, which today we would call politicides or genocides, but then didn't even have a word. The word genocide didn't come about until 1948. So it's a little bit tricky to say that nonviolent resistance could have forestalled those things, but I think violent resistance definitely moved them along, and that both world wars were largely due to kind of domestic instability that resulted in huge dissident government crackdowns and violence that destabilized the world and pulled these regimes into these alliances that then pulled them into the war.
Hello. My question is, so what is the organizational structure of a nonviolent movement, maybe like leadership-wise, and how does that function? Is it more spontaneous, or does someone call the shots, I guess? Or is it democratic?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of variation across these movements. Some of them are much more kind of decentralized, leaderless resistance type movements, and some of them are more centralized. Even if there isn't a single leader or figurehead, there's often some kind of coalition of leaders or a group of consensus-oriented leaders. And what I can say is that so far in the data, it looks like the more centralized versions are the more successful ones. It's not necessarily causal, it's a correlation I've found in the data, and I think that if it is causal, it's because the more centralized ones are able to facilitate things like training and organization and planning better than the more disparate movements that are decentralized and leaderless in a sense. That said, there's a new paper coming out by a grad student at MIT that looks at whether labor unions are at the forefront of the movement, and he finds actually that when they are, the movements are much more likely to succeed. And I think that's because of greater capacity for organizing, greater experience with skills required for dispute resolution, both internally and in negotiating with the opponent, and they often have much more kind of robust collective action potential that gives them an edge, even when they don't have as many people involved. So that makes some sense to me, and it just suggests that these movements do best when they are able to pull in these different coalitions, especially organized labor. And it can also present a real challenge for movements then to figure out how to negotiate among them, the different actors that join. My friend Stephen Zunis likes to say, if you're comfortable with everybody in your coalition, you're not in a coalition. And so I think that's a really important principle for movements to remember.
Cool, thank you so much.
Hello, and thank you for your talk. I was wondering, do you see a relationship to countries and cultures and the use of violent and nonviolent campaigns and how they fail or not fail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we looked at region of the world as a proxy for culture and sort of disposition toward one or the other, and we actually found that there was no change in terms of the failure rates for nonviolent and violent resistance, except in one exception, which is in Asia, where nonviolent resistance is equally as effective, but violent resistance is a bit more effective than on average. And I think that the reason for that is because of the Maoist technique of insurgency, which is basically like nonviolent resistance with a little bit of violence. It's all about organizing peasant class and organizing from the bottom up through the grassroots to engage in true popular revolution. There is an emphasis on building parallel institutions. There's an emphasis on developing a constructive alternative to the existing government. And by the time Mao had spent 20 years building coalitions among the peasantry in China, he was well positioned to engage in a mass violent uprising with their support. And in other countries that have adopted these Maoist techniques, we tend to see higher rates of success among the violent insurgents, but it's still less successful than nonviolent resistance.
Thank you.
I'm trying to understand Obama, you know, the community organizer, and he gets to Washington and forgets he's a community organizer. I don't know if you have any insights on how, you know, when you become president or you become the man, you kind of walk away from all that. What my other half of the part of what I'm trying to understand is I get this sneaking suspicion from Bernie Sanders that he's going to willing to call in the troops. Maybe not. But that's the gist I get from him, is that he's willing to say to folks, come to Washington, let's make a mess of this place until it shapes up.
So I guess the question is about like what happens to a nonviolent insurgent when they become part of the establishment, right? Part of the institutional group. And I would say, you know, this is often a key dilemma for different social movements is the expectation and then the subsequent disappointment with what's often referred to as selling out. And what you'll often see, actually, in different social movements is a period of recalibration because many different people who are the most effective leaders and organizers get hired into like professional positions, either organizing nonprofits or organizing at the sort of national level or the state political level. A lot of people have said things like this about John Lewis and other people as well. And I would say, you know, I mean, there are two ways to go about things. There's the outside-in strategy, and then there's the inside-in strategy. For me, what my research suggests to me is that people who are often accused of selling out are often then cast aside as alienated from the movement and not able to help. But I think that our research suggests that those people ought to be viewed as extremely easy to manipulate pillars of support, potential allies for the movement that aren't always going to come through for you, but can come through at really critical moments. And so if anything about this research speaks to your question, I think it would be to view the people that have made the choice to go into institutional politics as one's potential allies in the future, even if they don't look like it today. Imagine those troops defending the parliament in Belgrade, and the fact that all they had to do was in one moment say no, and it completely changed the course of that country. And so to alienate people and say, oh, they sold out or whatever, they're not gonna come through for us, might actually cut off the opportunity for them to say no in a critical moment that would help the movement. So for me, I try to think about who can I pull into my side rather than who can I push out of the movement. Okay.
Hi, thank you again for coming. My question is if you have looked at all at like the success rate of peaceful resolutions based on the general education level of the society that it takes place in.
Yeah, it's a good question. We did look at primary school rates and then secondary school rates, and neither of them ended up really revealing anything in the model, and I think part of that is it honestly might be because of horrible data quality. We don't really have good metrics of general education levels across the world during this entire time series. We've got it in more recent years, but it's not enough to actually make really confident inferences about it. I can tell you, though, that some of the most poignant cases of civil resistance that have succeeded have come in places where, with the lowest literacy rates in the world, like Mali in 1989 and 1990, which had almost no literacy in the black population, although there was some in the French population. But what they would do is, instead of writing down flyers or printing or anything along those lines, they would actually sing village to village about what they were going to do and how they were planning the next action. And they transmitted the message through song, and they trained through song, and then ultimately had a national uprising that removed a dictator in that country. So I think that people figure out a way to communicate where they are, and that, you know, I thought maybe that literacy would make a difference, but it didn't in the end.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if you found any correlation between the involvement of women in these campaigns and the ability of one to maintain a nonviolent approach, and secondly, to be successful.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, and I'm collecting data as we speak on this question. Part of the reason is because when I give workshops on this topic with people who've been very involved in activism, they often ask the question about, you know, how should women be involved, in what role and where, and in what types of tactics, and to what effect. And the truth is nobody's ever collected data on that. There's a recent trend in people collecting data on women in armed struggle, because everybody's really excited now that we know, oh, women actually engage in armed insurgency, you know, like, great. And so what I'm trying to do now is collect similar data to the ones that have been collected on women in armed insurgency, but for nonviolent campaigns. And what we're looking at is what proportion of the campaign is women, observably. Then what are their roles? Are they playing an active kind of confrontational role? Or are they playing passive support roles? Or are they playing symbolic roles? And then we're looking at basically whether there are any indicators of gender-based violence within the movement against the women, and whether there are indications of gender-based violence from outside the movement against them. And then we're also very interested in whether their participation is voluntary or coerced. And what we're interested in is looking at the impacts of those different metrics on whether the campaign is able to maintain nonviolent discipline over the long haul, and also whether it's able to stave off the worst forms of repression. Because I have a hunch that when women stay engaged in the movements, mass killings are much less likely. So we're going to test those things, and it'll be really useful when we know the answer.
Hi there, thank you for coming. My question is, how, if so, can we move to using civil resistance in ongoing wars such as the war on drugs in our country when the so-called opponent is of such an extreme and violent nature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, okay, the war on drugs is a tough one because it's not a discrete opponent per se, is it? Who would you say the opponent? Give me the discrete opponent in the war on drugs.
Sure. Coming from, say, the Mexican cartels and the cartels of South America, things of that nature.
Yeah, great. So I work with a PhD, well, she just defended her PhD. She's a professor at UNM, who wrote her thesis about civilian agency in the context of the drug war. And she did these amazing surveys of people in Mexico about their dispositions around whether they thought nonviolent resistance or violent resistance was more efficacious in protecting themselves against the cartels and also the Mexican government. And so ultimately what she found is that when people were aware of the story of Javier Cecilia, who's the sort of figurehead of the movement for peace with justice and dignity there, that they were like 40% more likely to be willing to engage in civil resistance and quite a bit more likely to say that they thought it would work. And that they had engaged in civil resistance and that they had found it to be effective in protecting themselves at a minimum. And when they were familiar with Gandhi, and when they were familiar with both, it was really high effect. So I think, again, the question is about how to spread knowledge about this in a way that resonates with people. And people can often figure out how to resist in their own situations in very clever ways that I couldn't anticipate or you couldn't anticipate. It's sort of like all of us, I don't know about you all, but I went through a stage when I was 2 years old, I mean, when I figured out how to make my parents blindingly angry just by not letting them pick me up. And they couldn't pick me up no matter how hard they tried. They were way bigger, they were way stronger, but I figured out a way to make it impossible. And I think that all of us have this ability, this creative ability to find ways to say no and disobey and subvert a larger power that's trying to harm us, or they weren't trying to harm me, but they're trying to make us do something that we didn't want to do, right? And so I think a lot of this is about kind of tapping into that very natural expression of human independence, and that people are able to, when they collectively organize, do really creative, incredible things. So I wouldn't put it by them, the Mexicans. I think they're doing amazing work.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So you spoke about how the soldiers at Belgrade were unwilling to shoot on civilians, yet in America we see during the Vietnam protests, National Guard absolutely willing to interact violently with nonviolent protesters. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to why that would be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly happens sometimes. I'd also say that in the long run, the anti-Vietnam War protests were pretty effective in changing the political conversation in the United States. So it is the case that you'll have episodes of violence and repression. It's not usually the case that civil resistance starts and that the soldiers immediately defect. But what can happen is that soldiers defect at critical political moments that alter the course of history. And so that's what happened in Belgrade. The movement had been brutalized for a couple of years before that. So I'd say that single incidents of horrific violence don't necessarily mean the end of a movement, although they are something to not deliberately provoke either, but they definitely don't necessarily end the movement because of the backfire dynamic. So I'd say Kent State, for example, backfired in a major way. It created massive moral outrage in the country. It drew in people into the support of the anti-Vietnam War movement that otherwise would not have participated, and I think that it changed things. So yeah, even though it was a deplorable act that we wouldn't have wanted to happen if we could have avoided it, the movement ended up being able to sustain itself and win the political conversation in the longer term.
Thank you.
Hi. So I was wondering if you think there's a way for, in America, which is a place that's so run by people who love guns and love violence, do you think there's a way for us to, if the government were to become too corrupt to run our country in a fair and equal way for every person, is there a way that we could peacefully stand up against the government despite all those people that are so violent in their tendencies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think yes, but I think that it couldn't happen spontaneously and in an improvised way. I think nights like tonight provide us with a sneak peek into what a nonviolent future might look like. But yes, it will require a lot of creativity and discipline, and the ability to pull in different sectors of society that have not worked together well in the past, and to win the argument about this, right? And that's the part that is that's really difficult. There are a lot of people that hold on to violence for lots of reasons other than whether it works. You know, there are lots of people who don't care whether it works or not. And so, you know, a big part of the conversation is about kind of trying to develop some common terms of understanding about like what's acceptable and what's effective and the way that we approach conflict in our society. And I think we all need a lot of help with that. So I'm very glad that you have this series, and I hope that you'll help me spread the word about this as well.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions?
Is your book required reading for community organizers?
Not that I know of.
I
don't know if you could. I don't know if you could get required reading for any community organizers.
One more question.
With all the conflicts that's happening and the violence on either side, how do you love the person that you're doing the civil disobedience against? How do you love them? I mean, it's very hard when there's this power that has a hold of you, and how do you commit to the nonviolence but be able to love them at the same time? Like Gandhi said, love your enemy or whatever, but how do you see that happening with this resistance?
Yeah, so this is a realm of the heart that I'm not as expert in, I must say. I mostly do stuff straight out of my head and into numbers, and I haven't quantified that one yet. But what I can say is that I've seen some incredible expressions of this done well in movements all over the world. And when I hear people talk about what's required to do that, like what Mandela was able to do upon leaving prison with forgiving his captors because he knew that if he didn't forgive them that he would suffer. And what, you know, Jesus, potentially one of the great nonviolent activists of all time, said about loving thy neighbor as you love me and you love yourself. Because basically we've had all of these examples of this golden rule that we have to like spend all this money and research uncovering that actually, yes, it's true. You know, the golden rule holds, and we sort of haven't won that argument yet either. So, to me, actually, the people that have done this well are mostly people that have been able to access some spiritual strength or some kind of religious or theological basis for making that argument, and that I think that is so powerful, and I think it's so necessary for many of these movements to tap into that as a wealth of connection and resource and community and support in moments where nothing but spiritual nourishment can help right now, right? And I think that many of the movements that I see around the world today kind of deliberately want to be separate from religious institutions and spiritual institutions because they want to be kind of secular and whatever. But I actually think spiritual and religious institutions are absolutely crucial in providing people with the moral and theological bases for being able to love somebody when they're doing something horrible and unforgiving to you. And what I'll just say, and I'm not going to go too much into detail about this, but just on a personal level, since we had a prayer earlier tonight, I'll just say that I have found prayer really useful and being able to forgive people for unforgivable stuff. So I do a lot of that on a daily basis to try to forgive people for things that have happened because it hurts me to hang on to it, and it's not useful in my life, and it interferes with my ability to be useful to the world. But I also wouldn't tell anybody else that that's the way they had to do it. But I would say that sources of spiritual support are so necessary in movements, and I hope that we don't forget that.
I think they liked it. I think they liked it. Again, thank you all for coming. We have a little reception out there in the lobby. Some books to sell. If you'd like to buy one, I'm sure you'd sell them one. And by the way, there's another little table out there too. They have some things to offer and things to sell too. You might want to take a look at that. The local chapter 80 of Veterans for Peace is here too, and I think they're on the same page. I know they are. Thank you all for coming.